Hello, everyone. This is Rodney Sobin at Nazio. I want to give it maybe another minute or so as people still phoning in. So if you could hold on for a moment, we will start very, very soon. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rodney Sobin at Nazio. Thank you for joining in today's webinar, which is run under the aegis of the Nazio Nehru Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group. We're glad to have both the State Energy Office and Utility Commission communities collaborating in this effort, and glad to have you all on this webinar. This webinar will focus on action steps for states moving towards a future with demand flexibility. We will start in a bit with a bit of an overview of the working group by me, followed by Monica Newcomb, our colleague at the Department of Energy, who will provide a summary of grid interactive efficient buildings. And the main show will be from Lisa Schwartz at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Next slide, please. First, a little bit about logistics. All the attendees are muted except for panelists. Please use the GoToWebinar, either the chat, there's a question box that's available, or we also encourage those to use the hand raising to ask questions during the Q&A session. As is inevitable in these webinars, there's always a question as to whether the recordings and slides will be posted, and the answer is indeed yes. So they will be posted on the Nazio website under events and past webinars. So we're very pleased to have two main speakers besides myself. Monica Newcomb will follow me in talking about Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings. She is a senior advisor at the USDOE Building Technologies Office and leads the Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings portfolio, including developing strategies for new directions at the Building Technologies Office and managing various analytic projects to establish a framework for GEB potential measurement. Previous to that, she's worked in a number of roles at DOE, focusing on energy efficiency, public-private partnerships, and developing the Better Buildings program. She will be followed by Lisa Schwartz of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. She's a deputy leader of the Energy Markets and Policy Group and the Energy Efficiency Team Leader in that group. She develops and leads energy efficiency research in the areas of policy, program design, implementation, and evaluation. She also manages technical assistance for states, which we'll be talking a bit about later, the Future Electric Utility Regulation report series, and provides and manages a plethora of training and education for states on distribution system planning. Next, please. So before going into a brief overview of the working group, I do want to go to the first poll, in which we're going to be asking basically, who's tuning in. So the poll, which is there, asks if you are with the State Energy Office or with the Public Utility Commission, other state or local government agency or quasi-governmental agency, a utility, or other. So if you would please take a moment to click your response, we would appreciate that. We'll give it 10 seconds. Okay, what are the answers? And I should mention I am joined by my colleague, Maddie Kohler, here at NASEO. So we have a pretty good mix of energy offices, commissions, and a smaller number of folks from other agencies in state and local government. Great. So let me give a very brief overview of the NASEO NARUC working group. The purpose of the working group is, well, a little bit of background. Advancing technologies are opening large opportunities for more flexible building and facility load management. You'll hear a little bit more from Monica in a few moments. Reducing costs, enhancing resilience, reducing emissions, helping manage the grid and dealing with peaks and ramp rates, especially as renewable resources grow in their penetration into the electricity supply. They can also, new technologies are offering new opportunities for energy efficiency to complement the other distributed resources, and the opportunity to integrate all these sorts of energy-related technologies. The fundamental questions we're interested in the working group is how can we optimize facility interactions with the grid? How can states fashion policies, programs, and regulations to advance this optimization through GEB, Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings? And what are roles for states, facility operators, utilities, energy service and product providers, and others? So very briefly, the working group, which is supported by the generosity of the Department of Energy's Building Technology Office, we're working to inform the states about GEB technologies and applications. We're very interested in identifying opportunities and impediments, meaning both technical and non-technical. We're also acting as a forum to raise state priorities, concerns, and interests, and having exchange among the states and between the states, the federal government, and other stakeholders, and increasing the recognition in states and others of the time variable and locational value of energy efficiency and other distributed resources. And of course, to enhance the system's reliability, resilience, and affordability as a whole. We want to inform state planning, policy, regulations, and programs, and also to advance the potential for roadmaps and pilots. We have a webinar series in which you are participating. We are working on a number of briefing papers, and the working group has had various sorts of state engagement, including state-specific calls, which have been very useful, topical exchanges, and I also want to point everyone to the workshop that we will be holding at the NASEO annual meeting on September 16th. Those of you who are part of the state working group, you've received some information about this, and we will be sending you a draft agenda pretty soon. We are looking forward to scoping a model road mapping kit, and I think what Lisa has to say today will very much help inform that activity, as well as to lead to potential pilots. We also have a potential for national laboratory help for the working group states. That's not quite in the bag, but it is a quite likely opportunity to have national labs assist the states with potential pilots and roadmaps, identifying their GEB potential, and other sorts of activities that can support their programs and policies. Briefly, I do want to recognize especially Casey Radcliffe of the Oregon Department of Energy and Hannah Terwilliger of the Minnesota PUC staff, who are co-chairs of our working group. And we've actually set up so they could have some comments a little later in the program. And there's a list of working group states. We do have a slide linking to our page on this working group. And I do again want to emphasize that this is done in collaboration with NARUC, and our colleague Danielle Sass-Burnett is the lead on the NARUC side. Maddie and I are managing this from the Nazio side. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Monica to give an overview of GEB.
Great. Thanks, Rod, for hosting this webinar, and thanks to both Nazio and NARUC for facilitating the working group that you just described. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes just teeing up our grid interactive efficient work, and then Lisa will really get into the fun details for today. So if we just skip to the definition slide. All right, so as Rod mentioned, at DOE, we're working on Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings initiative and really looking at the demand flexibility that can be provided by that. So I just wanted to start off with two definitions. I'd start with demand flexibility. So really we're looking at how behind-the-meter assets can adjust load profiles across different timescales. And this could be, just a few peak times of the year and reducing energy use during that time, all the way to daily shifting energy based on needs on the grid, and even down to seconds if there are power draw issues, for instance. And then a grid interactive efficient building is an efficient building that has smart technologies that is able to provide this demand flexibility for, a variety of reasons. It may be grid services, occupant needs and preferences, or cost reductions in an optimized way. So we should skip to the next slide. So some of the key characteristics of a grid interactive efficient building, really starting with driving efficiency, providing persistent low energy use to minimize demand at peak times or throughout the year. And then the two pieces that really provide the flexibility in addition to the efficiency are the connected and smart. So connected is providing the ability for two-way communication with flexible technologies, the grid and occupants. And then in addition to being connected, is the element of being sort of smart or smartness. And this is really driven by data analytics, energy management systems that have sensors and controls and are able to take inputs such as occupant preferences, the weather, maybe price signals, and optimize for whatever you're after. And then lastly, that should lead to flexibility, the idea of flexible loads that can be used to reduce, shift, or modulate energy use. So if we move to the next slide, this just points to the load management strategies that are possible with a GEB. As I mentioned before, the idea of efficiency, so reducing that energy use throughout the year. And then there's load shed and load shift. So the load shed is just a reduction of energy use. And then shift is really, if you're looking towards a longer time scale, so it might be, shifting to different times of the day, a few hours, and thinking about different strategies that you would want to employ to make sure that that shift is not impacting occupant comfort or productivity. And then modulate is down to that seconds level I mentioned, where it's really fast sort of services that would be provided. And then I'll point down to the bottom. If you optimize for all of these, the end goal is sort of this teal line, where you're looking for a lower, flatter energy use, net load. And then my last slide is just pointing to our C-Action report series. If you can move to the next slide, that Lisa will be teeing up today. So at Department of Energy, there's a partnership with EPA where we're working with state and local leaders called the C-Action Network. And right now there is a series around grid interactive efficient buildings. There are 3 reports that LBNL is leading. One is focused on essentially an overview for state and local policymakers. And so Lisa will be pulling out some key elements of that today. And then there's another 2 looking at assessing performance as well as valuing essentially demand flexibility. And so with that, there we go. There's the slide. So those are the 3 reports.
Sorry about the delay. That was a technical issue. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I think we just walked through it. There we go. And so we'll turn it over to Lisa to talk about the first report. And thanks to Lisa for the thought leadership and pulling together some key actions that hopefully will be helpful to states moving forward.
Okay, yeah, Lisa,
Thanks,
you are
Monica.
now up to bat. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Rod and Monica. So Monica just introduced grid interactive efficient buildings and the demand flexibility they can provide. And my presentation is focusing on action steps that states can take if they want to advance demand flexibility. Next slide, please. So first, let's put in context why demand flexibility is important. For starters, buildings represent 75% of electricity use in the US, and in some regions, buildings represent up to 80% of the peak demand. And I have a beautiful graphic on the next slide when it comes up. There we go. Because many building loads are flexible, buildings also represent the largest source of demand flexibility. Next slide, please. Importantly,
yes.
Demand flexibility can help states meet their own goals. So there are energy-related
sorry
goals.
for the just a moment. Sorry for the delay. We are having a little technical difficulties in advancing the slides. Hopefully, we will get there in a moment. Do you see the demand flexibility and state goals slide yet?
Not yet.
So we are working on this.
There we go. So toward helping states meet their own goals, there are energy-related goals that obviously demand flexibility can help with. Things like resilience, reliability, energy affordability is a big theme all across the board, emissions, energy efficiency, renewables, electrification, energy security, and grid modernization. And then there are also other goals that are broader where demand flexibility may be able to help, things like economic development and critical infrastructure. Demand flexibility also can be part of the solution to stresses on the grid that we're seeing today, like growth in peak demand and growth in variable generation. In some places, we've got congested delivery systems, and also in places we have electrification of new loads, like transportation. And when there are additional benefits to consumers and society, demand flexibility can provide higher value than traditional grid solutions. As examples for consumers, these demand flexibility assets, these technologies and systems in the buildings, they can improve building performance and give consumers more control over their electricity use. And for society broadly, benefits include things like jobs, energy security, resilience, a lot of the benefits we talked about above, environment, and public health. Next slide, please. Well, I should mention, finally, states are interested in demand flexibility for their own public buildings, both to save on electricity costs and improve resilience, and they can lead by example in these areas, also reducing energy waste and emissions. Okay, so now, Monica mentioned the C Action Report series on grid interactive efficient buildings that Berkeley Lab is producing for Department of Energy. The introductory report in the series will include a list of key actions states can take to advance demand flexibility, and then we'll get into more detail throughout the report series in many of these areas. So here on this slide, you've got just a high-level view of this draft set of actions in 3 buckets. First, gather information and identify opportunities. Second, develop and implement strategies to integrate demand flexibility into what you're already doing. And third, accelerate adoption. So this list shows who can take action in each of these areas. For states, that includes the Governor's Office, Public Utility Commission, State Energy Office, or another state agency, lots of them. For example, General Services, there are codes agencies, Departments of Environment, Department of Economic Development, Transportation, and there are also financing authorities that may be involved. And of course, overcoming some barriers to integrating demand flexibility may require state legislative action in some cases. There also are roles for cities and counties, obviously roles for utilities and regional grid operators. And we also call out opportunities for owners and operators of privately owned buildings to support these state activities. Next slide, please. So this slide blows up the first category, gather information and ID opportunities. And it includes 3 steps. First, consider how demand flexibility can support state goals. In what ways can demand flexibility help achieve energy-related goals and other aims? And if states establish an inclusive team at the outset, can work together to consider how demand flexibility can contribute to achieving these various goals. Next is inventorying opportunities and options, and then selecting ones for early action. So a good place to start is cataloging existing activities. What do you already have going on in terms of pilots, standards, programs, procurement processes, policies, and regulation? These things, can either directly address demand flexibility, or today might be limiting demand flexibility inadvertently. So you can consider ways to improve integration across all of these areas. Some examples are listed here. These are not all inclusive. Things like building operator training, energy savings performance contracting, the various incentives that utilities and state energy offices may be providing for different kinds of distributed resources, performance standards that states may have for existing buildings, and state codes for new buildings. States also can take initial steps to better integrate demand flexibility into a slew of planning processes, and there are a lot of them. There's, in some states, integrated resource plans. In pretty much all states, there are energy efficiency plans and often other types of distributed resource plans. Increasingly, states are getting engaged in distribution system planning and expansion of transmission systems, so not just utilities alone, but real state engagement there. And also, increasingly, we're seeing requirements or just guidance from the state for plans for grid modernization, electrification, and explicit plans that state energy offices have actually done for a long time on energy security, as well as resilience. We're seeing an increasing topic there. The states can identify also distributed energy requirements that may need updating. Everything from energy efficiency resource standards, perhaps they can also target peak demand savings, for example, and requirements for demand response so that the programs and regulations that we have might better integrate variable renewable energy generation and electric vehicles. There, of course, also are barriers to participation in some wholesale electricity markets where they exist in this country for demand flexibility to participate. Next slide, please. And last for this bucket, this first bucket of activities, pilot projects are often a good way to start to collaborate on, or states can conduct their own pilots on their own buildings and campuses. It helps you gain experience. It will help validate demand flexibility performance so everybody feels a little bit more comfortable, and demonstrate value both to the utility system and building owners. That can be especially important for hard-to-reach audiences, whether they're low-income households or they're smaller commercial buildings. And it's important for states to share what they learn in regional and national forums like this, so we can all learn from each other. Next slide, please. So the second bucket of activities, inventory options and select opportunities for early action, includes developing a roadmap to advance demand flexibility, mechanisms to allow building owners and occupants to earn money for providing grid services, and outreach and education about opportunities and benefits. So this slide blows up just one of these activities, the first one, the road mapping. It's really about engaging key stakeholders on possible strategies, establishing principles for what will be selected, things like cost effectiveness, consumer benefits and equity, but a lot more, and creating a comprehensive and collaborative approach. In my view, public commitment to achieving demand flexibility targets and metrics can be really helpful for success. Putting out a vision and ways that you plan to achieve that success. And roadmaps, of course, should be updated periodically, for example, every 3 years. Next slide, please. And finally, the last bucket here of activities is accelerate adoption. Going back to an earlier slide I showed, it includes actually 4 activities: assess and remove barriers, update economic valuation methods, establish practices for robust and cost-effective assessments, and then regularly assess and report on projects. And this slide only shows the first of these. So the barriers, as you know, range from technical to financial, institutional, and others. It's really good to develop a list of these barriers that are particular for your jurisdiction, but it's just as important to prioritize which barriers you want to tackle first, and then just get started. You know, in my experience, you don't have to tackle 100% of the barriers to make really good progress. Next slide, please. So here's a list of potential utility regulatory and market barriers to demand flexibility. There may be more, and certainly some of these barriers are not going to be relevant to your jurisdiction. If you don't have organized markets, you can sort of ignore that column. And you know, your state may have already addressed some of these barriers, or they may not have been present to begin with. So some examples that you may have on the utility side include alignment of retail rate design and program incentives with the time-sensitive and locational value of demand flexibility for electricity systems. Utilities also have disincentives and lack financial motivation to use buildings as energy assets. So that's sort of examples in the utility program area. For centrally organized wholesale electricity markets where they exist, there are barriers to entry for demand flexibility in some cases to provide energy, capacity, and ancillary services. And you'll notice that many of these barriers are in both columns here. They apply both to utilities and organized markets. Next slide, please. So at just a very high level, here are some opportunities to overcome barriers, things like studies, the market assessments, potential studies, enhancing analytical methods and practices for programs and for markets. And 2 examples here are economic valuation and performance assessment for demand flexibility in buildings. And these 2 areas are subjects of forthcoming reports in the C Action series. The first one, economic valuation by Tom Ekman, and the second one on performance assessment led by Steve Schiller. So you'll see those soon. Model standards, for example, for data access and data privacy, are helpful. Pilots discussed, and I'll talk about an example on the next slide. Programs for both residential and commercial buildings, you've got for, you know, both your utilities are running and state energy office programs are running. Financial incentives in some way for utilities are something that some states already provide, for example, for energy efficiency. Codes and standards are a key area here, of course. I'm a big fan of voluntary regional and national coordination and sharing information and results, and even potentially coming up with some model standards and ideas that are voluntary, but that may help move the ball forward. Certainly, governor's executive orders are helpful to get new programs going and to coordinate across state agencies. PUC proceedings, of course, will be key here. And like I mentioned, state legislative action may be necessary to remove barriers in some cases, for example, to third-party aggregation in some states, while also preserving consumer protections. Next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to provide a real example of a brand new pilot program that's testing technologies, retail rate design, and program design and implementation. So Portland General Electric is using what it's calling a test bed to better understand how to procure demand flexibility in both summer and winter, because PGE territory is now really dual peaking here in the Northwest. For residential customers, the utility is testing a wide range of technologies and a peak time rebate for reduced energy consumption when the utility calls events, and that could be when temperatures are very hot or cold, or forecasted wind generation is low, and a variety of other circumstances. The pilot's also going to test approaches on how to move customers from this peak time rebate to an opt-in utility direct load control program. That's just what the utility chose as a test. PG is also testing, importantly, customer value propositions. In other words, what really motivates customers to save when the utility calls events, to take action? So they're looking at several sort of messages. One is, and actually, activities. One is earning incentives, having this peak time incentive, for example, supporting, the messages around supporting renewable resources, that variable renewable generation requires in some areas, as it increases, more flexibility on the system. That can come from supply resources, but it also can come from the demand side. Reducing air pollution, competing with neighbors to reduce peak demand. This is very much like how the home energy reports work on the energy efficiency side. And PG wants to test this message for reducing peak demand. And then finally, donating credits to charity. In some cases, it's really not a financial motivation for people. It could be another type of motivation. So that's for the residential side. For the business side, for business customers, the utility is testing direct install for smart thermostats and also plans to add electric vehicle charging and storage. So you see here multiple distributed energy resources being involved. The utility is also coordinating with the third-party program administrator, Energy Trust of Oregon, on both energy efficiency and solar incentives for business customers. And importantly, the pilot is focusing on neighborhoods served by 3 distribution substations, because the utility wants to get representative substation level data. They've chosen, sort of different kinds of neighborhoods, and that substation level data will help them system-wide inform achievable potential for demand flexibility, help them come up with scenarios and modeling for future planning for distributed energy resources, and also for distribution system planning. The utility anticipates the second phase of the test bed and will further explore distributed resources as non-wire solutions for distribution systems going forward. So service area wide, the utility is targeting 69 megawatts in summer and 77 megawatts in winter to fill a 2021 capacity gap that it identified in its integrated resource plan. Next slide. So thanks for listening, and I think, Rod, we're back to you for Q&A in our panel.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was great. I'm sure it'll generate a lot of questions either now or afterwards. I do want to take a moment to note that our next webinar is coming up in a couple of weeks on August 27th. Lisa, ending with the PGE testbed as a pilot, it foreshadows our August 27th webinar, where we will have Southern Company talking about its Alabama Power project, as well as a new project with Georgia Power that's starting up. They have actual live data from the Alabama Power project, as well as we're planning to have speakers from Excel's Colorado operations on a couple of pilots they have there in the Denver area. So that will be very interesting. So stay tuned for that. Hope you can join us for that. We will go to poll number 2 now, which asks, which category best reflects your current status with GEB and demand flexibility? So the choices are you in the position of just gathering information and identifying opportunities? Are you a little further ahead, developing and implementing strategies? Are you accelerating adoption? Or is it none, we are not interested, in which case I'm not sure why you're here, but you're welcome nonetheless. So please, 10 seconds to answer that. Please select one, I believe, in this case. Let's see what it shows. Okay, most people are gathering information and identifying opportunities. A smaller but non-negligible number are developing and implementing strategies. So that's very good to hear, and I hope after this webinar and in the future as we move forward with the working group, that those of you who answered that will give us a bit more information so we can share that among the states. Okay, the third poll question, which I believe is the last that we have planned, is what is sort of feedback for us and our NARO colleagues. Which actions would be most helpful to explore? Engaging key stakeholders, establishing principles like related to cost effectiveness, creating a comprehensive approach to demand flexibility, estimating costs and benefits, or benefits and costs, or making public commitment to specific targets. And this is one where select all that applies. So please take the next few seconds to do so. And let's see what it shows. Good. So let's see. Estimating benefits and costs comes in at first place, edging out establishing principles. Probably not statistically significant difference, but up there. Followed by creating a comprehensive approach to demand flexibility, and then the others. So this is very helpful for us as we move forward on this effort. So we come to the Q&A discussion session, and I do remind you to use the question box and or use the raise hands. We do have the ability to unmute specific individuals. We have already had a number of queries, so I'm going to ask those who are in the queue to say a few words, and we'll start off with Casey Radcliffe from Oregon, who is graciously one of our co-chairs of our working group, and she knows something about the Portland General Electric. Casey, are you able to speak up?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you, Lisa, for outlining the PG testbed. I just wanted to provide a few specifics there because I've had some questions from folks on the programmatic design. So I'll just add a little bit. I think Lisa did a great job of really hitting on the core elements of the program around customer valuation, and really understanding that the customer plays a critical role. And part of the customer profile that they've done in choosing those 3 communities, they're targeting 20,000 customers. And for the first aspect of the program, the customers will get a notification through email or text for these on-call events to reduce their energy use. They're expecting 10 to 20 events per year. And the customers earn a $1 credit per kilowatt hour that they save from their baseline. So PG is hoping to get about 2/3 of the customers participating in this peak time rebate. The average is usually around 6, so that's quite a big jump from a traditional program. And then they also are targeting about 40% for industrial and 25% participation from small and medium-sized businesses. They're also working directly with each city to develop these kind of locale specific approaches that will involve creation of a community organizer, employee ambassadors who live in the community, and then working with city administrators to increase participation to a pretty high customer involvement rate. And they've just launched this officially. They had their news release go out, and they've messaged it as we're paying customers to use less electricity, and that these rebates are the first and broadest element of a program that will go much deeper. So as Lisa covered, the program is going much farther than traditional demand response, and that was developed in that their integrated resource plan to meet capacity need included the demand response, but as the concept has evolved, they've recognized that storage, grid functionality, electric vehicles are going to need to be part of this. So I think that highlights what Rodney's question about the role of utilities and regulatory commissions. The integrated resource planning process really identified that going beyond this traditional DR in this pilot test bed would be a way of hitting on these multiple benefits and aspects of what we could see in a grid interactive building approach. So I think the framing is really important, that customers are in charge, as Lisa mentioned, that additional benefit of customers having more control. And the program coordinators are seeing that it may be that community benefit aspect around environment and charity and working together has the highest value proposition for customers. they're also highlighting that they want customers to feel special and that they're the first and innovators in their communities. So really focusing on customer-driven messaging. And we're really interested to see what the feedback from that will be, being that this is in some ways very similar to other energy efficiency messages and marketing, but this grid aspect does really open up the potential to get new customers involved or give a new benefit to those groups. So I think we are really interested to see that evolve, but we also have a lot of questions, and I know that the feedback we get from this pilot, PG is really interested in seeing what messages are working. And I guess my follow-up question, Lisa, if we can, is wondering, as we get information back from customers on messaging, are there any specific data portions or partnerships that we as a state energy office should be targeting now, so that as we want to accelerate adoption in the future, when we know what pathways are most successful, should we be getting primed or ready with any data or partners that as an energy office we could really make sure we're ready and able once we know what mechanisms work best at the utility level?
That's a great question, Casey. I mean, I think, this idea that everyone shouldn't, state by state necessarily, sharing information means that some states can benefit from others. But I think within a state, which I think that's part of what you're asking, if you've got a state energy office that obtains data, or the utility has the data, and the state energy office can facilitate getting that data elsewhere, it'd be great to get that to your other state agencies that may get involved in these things, both, the folks that are involved in public building procurement and management, say the, general services kind of, administrative services kind of branch, but also the audiences that have to be targeted for demand flexibility to work. So, building owners and operators. States do building operator training. So, having appropriate messaging there from business customers of PG might be useful. So I think that's a really important thing that, if we think about, we take action after we hear the same kind of message from multiple channels. I think that's important to think about here.
Okay, thank you very much, Casey. That was very helpful to speak more about that, the PGE, and very interesting to hear about the customer engagement and sort of more of the social side as well as the hard dollars and cents. And thank you, Lisa, for the response. Another hand up is from our Minnesota participants. Hannah Terwilliger is the PUC side co-chair of this working group, and her colleague Lindsay Anderson from the State Energy Office. I believe they have some questions or comments. Hannah and Lindsay, are you on?
Hi, this is Hannah. Yeah, so I was just going to add from the PUC perspective, kind of things that we're seeing in Minnesota. We continue to see a lot of increased interest and offerings, program pilot approvals from our utilities around things like electric vehicles, demand response, distributed generation. But we're a lot of times seeing these come in as individual programs or pilots, and instead would really like to start thinking more about how they can work together instead of as a discrete program. So really thinking about that residence or business facility as an entire unit and how that can really help the state achieve its energy policy goals of increasing renewable energy and reducing carbon emissions, but still maintaining safe, affordable, reliable electric service. And so I think, Lisa, as you're working on developing these guidelines, thinking about how we can, as public utility commissions, kind of start to think about all these disparate programs that we have coming in as one instead of as one unit instead of as multiple, and how we encourage our utilities to think about things more holistically, especially as an entity that works on the receiving end of pilot programs versus being kind of the instigator of those efforts.
Okay, that's very helpful. Lindsay, were you going to also say a few words?
So from the State Energy Office, we have a program, Minnesota Sustainable Building 2030 program, initiated in 2008 that aims to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by lowering energy use in the state's commercial, institutional, and industrial buildings. It's required for all state bonded projects. And we are currently going through a performance standard transition from 70% to 80% in 2020. And that's requiring us to review some of the programmatic elements of cost effectiveness, the use of energy efficiency and renewable generation to meet those energy efficiency performance targets. And so we're exploring some of the GEB grid services benefits when looking at that program transition. And I would be interested in talking to other states about if similar programs that they may have that are triggered for public buildings or state-funded buildings, for how they work with their different partners and what they consider as maybe as a performance standard is enhanced or what they're doing to work on their program. So
great. So just a side note that in our interviews with the 14 states participating in the working group, a good number of them have state or public building objectives as part of their motivation for pursuing GEB and load flexibility. So this is very interesting to hear. Lisa, did you have any comment? If not, I'll move on to the next raised hand.
Yeah, why don't we move on and hear more questions or comments?
Okay. So I believe Eric Friedman from Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, did you want to offer some comments?
Sure, just checking you can hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Great, all right, thank you very much. So thanks for holding this webinar. It's very interesting. It's obviously a topic that is growing quickly in interest, I think, around the country. And certainly here in Massachusetts, we are taking steps to try and develop and implement policies statewide that are moving us toward GEBs, which I think we need to come up with a different acronym, but we'll save that for another call. So I wanted to just quickly go over two kind of background elements of some of that are driving some policies here in Massachusetts, and then at a very high level mention, again, very quickly, 4 policy areas that are, at least in theory, moving us in the direction of grid interactive efficient buildings and really creating a set of systems where buildings can be interacting more effectively with our grid. So first of all, I'll just start off by saying that the big driver of all this are a set of long-term policies around greenhouse gas emissions. State legislation from about a decade ago requires us to achieve an 80% reduction in statewide emissions by 2050. So that is driving a lot of our efforts across our efficiency and renewable policies. We've seen since that time pretty dramatic reductions in emissions from electricity. Right now, only about less than 20% of our statewide emissions come from electric. The vast majority of remaining emissions come from the thermal sector. We have lots of heating here, of course, as well as transportation, which is now the largest greenhouse gas emitter in Massachusetts. So that has led to some studies and some planning efforts. Over the last couple of years, we've come out with a study looking at the benefits and reality and technical feasibility of storage as a cost-effective way of dealing with peak as well as increased renewables, as well as a comprehensive energy plan that we released last year that essentially said if we're going to have any hope of getting to longer-term goals, we need to combine aggressive efficiency and conservation, fuel switching toward electricity, as well as increasing our renewable supply. So those are kind of that's the background. The 4 major policy areas include continuing our efforts on developing clean energy supply. That's through legislative requirements for a variety of portfolio standards. We have a number of procurements, long-term procurements that we are legislative mandated to implement for offshore wind and hydro, and both of those are underway. And then we also have a number of programs working to increase our deployment of distributed generation, primarily solar PV across the Commonwealth. We've seen about a 10-fold increase in the last 6 years and looking to get to about 4,000 megawatts over the next couple of years in total. We also have some pretty robust energy efficiency programs that are really important in keeping our load down, both overall consumption as well as our peak demand numbers. Those programs have been very effective, achieving about somewhere between 2.5–3% of our load through efficiency programs. But the new 3-year plans that manage those programs have gone beyond just looking at electricity reduction, which has been the primary focus in previous plans, and have been expanded to look at overall BTU reduction, as well as expand to a number of different types of energy programs, which I'll talk about in a sec. So this has actually led to efforts to really think seriously about electrification of our thermal and transportation sectors. We are doing that through a variety of incentive programs. Not enough time to talk about them all, but in our alternative portfolio standard and energy efficiency programs, fuel switching and incentives for heat pumps are fairly robust. So that is one way we are trying to move people off of dirtier fossil fuels and more expensive fossil fuels, at least to start, and then hopefully moving toward the more common and cheaper fossil fuels down the road. We've also got a number of electric vehicle efforts underway. We have multi-state agreement with a number of states to get 300,000 EVs on the road by 2025. That's just here in Massachusetts. And our utilities have actually undertaken pretty big funding programs for electric vehicle infrastructure and are kind of in the first year, give or take, of implementing those, and have some pretty robust goals to get charging stations all around the state. And then last but not least, I'll just mention that obviously as we move toward electricity, a lot of what we talked about here today, dealing with demand flexibility, making sure our peaks, we can deal with our peaks, and obviously including storage in that, have become very important. And so we have a number of programs underway to incentivize and increase storage and peak demand efforts, including efforts now in our energy efficiency programs that specifically address peak. That's the first time we've done that in our energy efficiency programs. So there are utility incentives for both storage deployment as well as active demand response efforts. And then we have a new program under development called the Clean Peak Standard, which should be coming out with sort of draft numbers this fall and should be in place early next year. And that will provide direct and specific incentives for technologies that actively and directly reduce peak, primarily storage. And there will be a number of caveats, a number of variables that will influence the level of incentives that someone will get, but it's a performance-based standard that will essentially reward folks for generating energy through storage elements at peak times that have been pre-designated. So I'll kind of stop there.
Thank you, Eric. You all are doing quite a bit of work up there, and we'll certainly, as through the working group, we'd like to stay tuned on some of your progress. The Clean Peak seems quite innovative. Your EE 3-year plan, I recall that there was some active demand response element to that. So integrating the EE with the DR is kind of interesting as well. So we do have another hand raised from Colorado. I think Jocelyn and Kim, are you interested in piping in? If you are speaking, you are on mute. Well, that does not seem to have worked. So Jocelyn and Kim, if you try again to unmute, let us know. In the meanwhile, let's go on to another question that came in. I think this was actually regarding the Portland General Electric. Maybe Casey can actually answer this. There was a question about differentiating between in the residential customers. I think you mentioned that there's a certain number of residential customers targeted for participation. And the question was whether there's a differentiation between the single family and multifamily.
That's a great question. I know that single family was a large portion of just the residential customer profile, but I'm not sure if they have a separate or distinct multifamily outreach. So that's something I can definitely follow up on and pass some information through. Great,
thank you. So another question, and this is probably more for Lisa, is there are some jurisdictions and utilities that have very low smart meter penetration, or AMI, and I guess one question is, are smart meter and AMI synonymous, or are they a bit different from each other? What can be done in places where there are not smart meters with respect to load management and GEB?
Yeah, I think this is an important question and something that I think DOE is planning to look more into and provide some technical assistance on, perhaps through the labs. But, you know, there is a difference. So advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI, those meters measure and record usage data at least hourly and provide usage data at least daily to utilities. So that's, you know, the official Energy Information Administration definition. And so, you know, the infrastructure also includes two-way communication that's capable of recording and transmitting the data instantaneously. So, you know, that would be great, right? But advanced metering, you know, advanced meters are only installed in about, you know, about half the meters in this country, right? And so in a lot of locales, there are advanced meters, but it's not quite the same. There's sort of automated meter reading that allows the utility to roll trucks still, you know, but just like drive by instead of having to come up and look at your meter. But, you know, they're driving by. So that, you know, that data is like, you know, they're pulling that data once a month maybe, or once every other month, one way, right, just from the meter to the utility. And that's it. And it's really just for billing purposes. So if you don't have an advanced metering infrastructure and the communication, the two-way communication system, it doesn't mean that you can't do a lot of this stuff. You know, there are, and I think we're all aware here on the call, there are smart thermostats that the thermostat itself has the equipment to communicate back to the utility and also receive a signal from the utility or from your demand response aggregator. So, you know, you can still do a lot of this without having the advanced metering. But for the larger buildings, they have, you know, building, you know, automation systems, you know, called various things. But, you know, a lot of the buildings, you know, that are smaller don't have that. Again, you know, those things can be addressed either through, if you have an energy management system, for a long time now, well before advanced metering infrastructure. You know, for example, Portland General Electric had a program for business customers where they used the building's own, you know, building energy management system. And they didn't worry about having advanced metering infrastructure. So there are ways to make progress and get around it without AMI. And also for, you know, trying to understand assessing performance of the building in terms of demand flexibility. There are ways to do with sub-metering and so forth where the assessment can be done. But obviously the stuff will be a little easier in areas with advanced metering infrastructure. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. That's very helpful because I think that is an impediment in many places that the AMI doesn't exist. And, you know, even just personally, I have a dumb meter, but I do have a DR box on my air conditioner, which is sort of, you know, ancient technology, which can lead to another question on the distinction between older traditional demand response and newer GEB. But I do want to give a moment. I believe our Coloradans are back online. So if Jocelyn and Kim, if you can pipe in, if it doesn't work, you did type in your question and I can pass it along in that manner. Okay, maybe not. So let me read off their question. And I guess this is for Lisa as well. What opportunities can reduce silos for DER planning or pilots such as between EE, energy efficiency, and RE, renewable energy, without a comprehensive makeover of state planning processes, such as instituting an IRP. So reducing silos across these different forms of distributed resources, and how can one sort of draw them in short of a radical overhaul of a state's resource planning process? Want to give that a shot, Lisa?
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar to sort of a comment and that we had earlier about sort of being on the receiving end of utility programs, and it's hard sometimes to encourage the utility to go across programs that involve a host of distributed resources, from energy efficiency to demand response to storage. So I mean, I think one of the things here is that we have states like Massachusetts, we have utilities like Portland General, and not just on the coast. We have example programs throughout the country, some of which I'll be featuring in the introductory report to the Sea Action series for Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings, where there are real live utilities that are doing just this. They are not just stopping at demand response. They're actually, in some cases, taking their demand response programs, making them more real time, targeting the problems that are happening today, like integrating, transportation that's electrified, and integrating storage and not just demand response. And they're putting these things together. They're putting multiple distributed energy resources together, and they're making these things more interactive. So I think that, sort of going back to the question that you just hinted at, Rod, it really gets to that question of what is different here, than just traditional demand response programs that we've had for a while. And so I think for me, I boil it down to three differences. One is we're really looking at a broader set of timeframes. So for demand response, it's been traditionally used primarily as a capacity resource. And so we haven't necessarily been worried about really granular timeframes. It just depends on what the program is. But here, I think for grid interactive buildings and demand flexibility, we're trying to go for a broader set of timeframes, from sub-seconds, like Monica suggested, if you're trying to work on frequency regulation, or to minutes to hours to even seasonal. So I think that's one thing. We're also trying to optimize across multiple distributed energy resources, and this really gets to breaking down the silos. So we're not just talking about demand response, we're also talking about battery storage. We're talking about electric vehicles. We may be talking about combined heat and power, rooftop solar, and energy efficiency. And we're optimizing those multiple distributed energy resources that can provide demand flexibility, both for the grid and for occupant preferences, so that the stuff really is helpful both to consumers and the electricity system. And then I think the third difference from sort of traditional distributed, resource programs like demand response is we're providing multiple grid services, so not just capacity, like demand response has provided historically, but also, for example, non-wires alternatives for distribution systems, and some ancillary services, whether they're, contingency reserves or ramping or frequency regulation. So I see those as sort of, if we can get across, it is a new concept, but it's not like some states aren't already and some utilities aren't already doing this. We're trying to optimize across multiple timeframes, multiple types of distributed resources, multiple grid services.
That's fantastic. So we are past the hour. If you can stay on for a few more minutes, that would be great. I know some people have left and others will have to leave. But I do want to ask if Monica, if you're still on the phone, there is a U.S. General Services Administration working group or effort in this area, and that would be quite analogous to what states encounter in their state public buildings programs, whether they're operated out of the state energy office or out of a landlord or general services agency. So if you're still with us, if you could say a few words about the GSA effort, I think that may be helpful for many of the states.
Sure. Maybe just a few things to call out. So there was recently a report released that Rocky Mountain Institute performed, and they did an analysis looking across the GSA portfolio to see the flexibility potential and the economic benefit of it. And so that might be something, Rod, if you're able to send that out, that could be interesting for states. There's also some work going on right now just sort of exploring ESPCs as a financing mechanism and how that could fit into building on top of energy efficiency financing. And then last, GSA is looking to do a pilot with a number of their facilities, exploring, just these questions and thoughts that we are discussing today, looking at potential, understanding operation, impact on occupants, etc. So they are looking to release, they call it a request for proposal in early this fall, probably in October, which, something like that might be interesting, that language we could share in the future too, for states who would be looking to do similar types of pilots.
Great. Thank you for that information. The RMI report, we will soon post it on our resource page and make the working group aware of that. And I'm wondering if when we post this recording, if we can put in a link to our NASEO page. We'll explore that. So we are way past time. Many thanks, Lisa. Many thanks, Monica. And especially many thanks to the state participants, those who piped up and those who didn't pipe up, all of you. Thank you very much for participating. Our next webinar will be on the 27th with Southern Company and Excel. We hope you can join us then. And we hope to see many of you at the NASEO annual meeting in September, particularly the GEB working group and roundtable that we will hold on that Monday. So if anyone does have questions regarding the working group and our work, please let us know. One of the slides has Maddie and my contacts, as well as Danielle from Nehru. So again, many thanks and have a great rest of the day. Take care, everyone.